Welcome to GSI's SNU today, and we have a very special speaker who is going to talk about war in Ukraine, which is one of the most serious global events that is going on. But at the same time, I'm here not as a dean, but as one of the audience, really, because I really wanted to listen to what Professor Lee has to say about all this, because I have a great admiration about his specialty and expertise, especially in the field of international security, which happens to be my area of interest as well. And in fact, our personal relationship goes quite long way back to 80s, and we are very close colleagues. And not only during our undergraduate years, I was 2 years ahead of his study at SNU. But then, when I was in New England doing security study, he also came to New England, Harvard University, joined, and we also spent some of our graduate years, like you guys here. And at the time, we had many discussions and good times, talked about many things. So I have a very special personal ties to Professor Lee, but not because of that, but most of all, as far as I can see, he is the most authoritative scholars and academics when it comes to international security in Korea, but not only in Korea, but also in the region and in the world. And finally, he's very, very difficult to get. He's one of the most difficult speakers to invite because he doesn't talk about. He doesn't come. He doesn't show up in this kind of public setting often. So in that sense, this is also a very rare opportunity for us to listen to him. And that my thanks goes to Professor Sogang who in fact arranged all this today's event. She also studied at Harvard with Professor Lee, and so maybe thanks to her personal time or her effort, finally we have Professor Lee here. So please, enjoy his lecture and ask lots of questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim, for the very nice welcome remarks. So briefly introduce Professor Geunwook Lee. So as Professor Dean Shin just mentioned about, Professor Geunwook Lee, he has been one of the experts in the Korean security studies. In particular, he has been working on the alliance politics, but recently he has been writing a lot of the work on the international conflict ranging from the Afghanistan, and he's writing on the Russian-Ukraine crisis, and currently he is also working on the Middle East as well. So today I asked him to present titled "The Russia's War in Ukraine: Tactical Incompetence, Strategic Desperation, and Potential Disaster in Eastern Europe." So he is going to deliver a very interesting perspective, not only from the more policy aspect, but also theoretical perspective. So please welcome Professor Lee with a big hand of applause.
Thanks for the introduction, especially the nice one from the Professor Jiyeoun and also the old colleague of the Dean, the Shin Sung-ho. Actually, yes, he said that our history, the Professor Shin Sung-ho's and the history of the academic lives in the professional life and the academic life at this campus back to trace in the 1980s. Well, I'm old. Okay. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to be here and to speak here, and most of all to present my idea and my understanding about this war. And this war is one of the quite interesting in many sense war armed conflict in these days. First, it was probably the first one in this history, in this century, the first major war between the kind of sizable armed forces on an open field. We have conflict at the beginning of this century, the American invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Both of them, in terms of a combat phase, both of them ended in very short. However, this war, the Russia's war in Ukraine, kind of last 2.5 years and counting. And the second, most of the analysts believe that the war would be over in a week or so. It was February 2022, but all proved to be wrong. I was one of them, and I was shocked to see the first topic of today's presentation is tactical incompetence of Russian army. Russian steamroller were simply broken. The third one is that Russia is strategically more and more desperate in these days. So Putin is kind of toying the idea of using nuclear weapons, tactically and strategically. And the third issue that probably these potential disasters in Eastern Europe might be prevented if the Russians were more successful on the battlefield. However, since the war is stalemated and Putin needs Kim Jong-un's assistance and Xi Jinping's support to continue his war in this country, therefore everything will be screwed up, I'm afraid. So these three issues are the topics that I'm going to address in today's presentation. Okay, why did Putin invade? The backgrounds. The first issue is everybody knows that NATO expanded. And some believe that NATO expanded too much, and which provoked Russia. It is accurate description in one sense, but on the other hand, it just simply disregarded the realities on the ground at the beginning of the 1990s. The story, in my opinion, the story should have been started with the Soviet nuclear legacy. During the Cold War, Soviet Union and the United States deployed thousands and tens of thousands of nuclear warheads on their own soils. At that time, the Ukraine was part of Soviet Union, so the Soviet nukes almost 30,000 nuclear warhead and plus, and Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan had hosted each 15 to 20,000 nuclear warhead. So altogether, we had a serious problem. When Soviet Union simply disappeared, we had the number of nuclear warhead, the Soviet nuclear warhead deployed in Ukraine, which was 1,512 nuclear warhead, only in Ukraine. So at that time, the critical question is how to dismantle the Soviet nuclear legacy. That was the beginning of CTR, Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, usually known as non-Ruger program. Americans provided the subsidies, financial incentives to these countries, and Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan decided to return. At that time, it was called return all of the nuclear warhead on their soil to Moscow. In exchange, Russians guaranteed these three countries political independence and territorial integrity. It was Budapest Memorandum of 1994. Yeltsin signed the document. So in the Budapest Memorandum, these three countries, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, returned all of their nuclear warhead to Russia, and in exchange, Russia guaranteed these three countries political independence and territorial integrity. That's the one issue. Another issue is NATO expansion. Originally, NATO and Soviet border was just like here. it was East and West German border during the Cold War. And when I was at the freshman in the college, which was 1989, I still remember the TV news footage that Berlin Wall simply gone. Berlin Wall collapsed, and the Eastern Europe began to fall apart. German reunification. During the negotiation, James Baker, the American Secretary of State, guaranteed that NATO would not expand, not 1 inch eastward. So we have news footage that not 1 inch speech. It was made and delivered by the Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State, in a public place. It was February 1990. So what is interesting, what is more interesting is Russian government decided not to follow this speech. So we have, until today, we have no written record about this speech in Russian archive and American archive. We have really news footage. We have clearly evidence that Secretary of State said, delivered this idea in the public place, but there is no public record, public paper, diplomatic notes, or anything like that. Probably it was ad lib. The problem is NATO began to expand beginning in 1999. So we have all of these countries colored in here are the member of NATO. It was 1990s, Russian government hated this idea. However, since Russia did not protest it much, NATO expanded. Ultimately, nobody touched this issue. Probably Russia had some grudge, and this grudge was, in my opinion, reasonable. That's the one issue. Another issue is, so this picture looks familiar, right? Who is this? How to characterize Russia? That's another issue. I said that Russia has some grudge. Russia is not satisfied, but it does not guarantee that Russia will behave revisionistically. We have a lot of ways to characterize this country. NATO expanded, okay. Russia has grudge, okay. Then, was Russia seriously concerned about its security, or was Russia provoked? That's another issue, purely theoretically. Russia was concerned and provoked, and all of a sudden Russia just cornered. NATO expanded too much. All of these arguments based on the single theoretical concept of the security dilemma. Security dilemma is defined as a situation one state's security-driven measures will decrease, will undermine the security of the neighbors. We do this and these things for our own support, for our own survival. However, our behavior, our actions ultimately undermine, ultimately weaken the security of our neighbors, so things are not stabilized. That's a very important theoretical concept, and that is foundation of one way to understand Russia's behavior. Another way to understand this idea is this picture. This picture presents that Putin is a Hitler. Putin's Russia found itself in the middle of a security dilemma? No. It implies that since Putin is a Hitler, Putin's Russia is a Nazi Germany, which is a revisionist state. This state is deeply, deeply concerned not only about its own survival, but also seriously interested in territorial expansion. Just like Nazi Germany in the second half of the 1930s and in the first half of the 1940s. Since it is Nazi Germany, this country, the behavior, it cannot be justified in terms of security dilemma. This country was not so provoked. This country is responsible for the war. NATO expanded, Russia's grudge provoked Russia. All of these arguments, in this second interpretation about the war, is wrong. Why? We are not talking about Adolf Hitler was provoked. Nobody believes that Nazi Germany's situation was a security dilemma. This is expansionist country. This is revisionist country. This is deeply, deeply dissatisfied country. We cannot make a deal with this country. So Putin's Russia has a revisionist aim. However, its capability is not so sufficient. Russia's GDP is more or less smaller than South Korea's GDP. There are several ways to characterize Russia, but my favorite way to understand this country is Russia is a Saudi Arabia because it is pumping the oil and make the money out of the global market without exporting and manufacturing anything. This is Saudi Arabia. But great difference between the Saudi Arabia on the one hand and the Russia on the other is Moscow has nuclear weapons and geopolitical ambition. So those who are interested and those who study international relations theory probably know about this person, Jiyeoun Mearsheimer, offensive realism, and he's known to be the defender of Russia's foreign policy for the last 10 years. His basic argument is something like that NATO expanded too much. Russia was provoked. But what is interesting is Mearsheimer's theoretical argument implies that states endlessly maximize its power. States aim to be the most powerful country in the world. So if we accept his theoretical argument, then we have serious logical contradiction between Putin's defender Mearsheimer on the one hand, who believes that the West, United States, and NATO countries should have struck a deal with Moscow on the one hand, and IIA theorist Mearsheimer, who proposed offensive realism, suggests that states maximize its power, states expand endlessly, states behave aggressively, continuously, permanently. All of these dark and pessimistic images of international relations usually summarized under the title of offensive realism is simply wrong. We have two Mearsheimer's idea. Mearsheimer, as a theorist, cannot define, in my opinion, Mearsheimer, Putin's defenders' argument in terms of a foreign policy. So since this half of the audience are not Korean, so probably you don't read this part. But it is said of Mearsheimer versus Mearsheimer. I published this article at the beginning of this year in the 국제정치논청, and it says that, okay, that's what I'm saying. Mearsheimer theorist should have something bad about Putin, but he does not. We have a theoretical and logical contradiction between the two Mearsheimers. This is a kind of job that I did when I trained as an IIA theorist. However, in these days, I simply ditched my old job. I'm more and more interested in the technical and operational side of this work. Let me give you an example. Okay. I'm not sure how many of you are interested in the military history of the Second World War. But those who are not probably heard the name of this town, Stalingrad, right? In these days, there is no Stalingrad. In 1960s, when the Soviet Union decided to kind of delete Stalin's legacy, the town was renamed as Volgograd. Where is Volgograd in this map? Does anybody who can just pinpoint, just a kind of point the location of the old Stalingrad and currently Volgograd? No? Clearly not here, but somewhere around here. The location, the distance between Donetsk and Volgograd, if you just use the Google map, it's going to have some kind of 700 kilometer. 700 kilometer is a kind of a distance between this town, the Seoul, to Qingdao in Germany. I'm sorry, in Qingdao in the German-Birk town in China. 80 years ago, this area was the field of the worst battlefield in human history. In Kiev, the Russian pronunciation of the capital city of Ukraine, Kyiv in these days. Kiev was captured twice, first by the Germans, second by Soviet. In September 1941, when Nazi Germany captured this town, there were 600,000 Soviet POW. 600,000. That is larger than the entire ROK army these days. Until today, how many casualties Russians have and suffered from? Roughly 700,000. In a single battle, Soviet Union lost 600,000 soldiers. I'm giving this number because currently the combat around this country and the combat around this war is much smaller, almost 1/10 of the size of the Second World War. It is a major war, yes, but it is a smaller war in scale, yes. Smaller than what? Smaller than the Second World War. And another issue that I'm trying to address today is, wow, they are really, really lousy. In December 1979, Soviet special forces invaded Afghanistan and captured Kabul, executed the Afghan president in 7 hours. And Russians failed to do that in Afghanistan. In Ukraine. Failed to capture the Kyiv, and the war has been prolonged for a long time. Ukraine, people just say that Ukraine's resistance was so heroic, yes, and the Russians put up steep resistance. However, steep resistance was possible only because the Russian invasion was so lousy. That is why every day the Ukrainians don't lose, they win politically. That was the kind of PR propaganda that the West and the Ukrainians conducted at the beginning of the war. And at the beginning of the war, it was true. The lower this lower picture was taken at the end of February 2022. It was a Russian supply column. It was almost 30 kilometers north of Kyiv. And Russians failed to handle the situation. The West provided weapons, yes, and the money and the more. And more means technical and intelligence assistance to Ukraine, and ultimately, Ukraine sustained itself. Russians failed to feed their soldiers on the ground. So if you just recollect your memories about the beginning phase, the initial phase of the invasion, you probably remembered a lot of news reports that the Russian soldiers are starved, and that they were given the military ration, which were scheduled to expire 10 years ago. It was a reality on the ground. Russians were lousy. Once again, Russians have repeated the same mistakes over and over again. That's another issue. Okay, if you are smart, and I believe that everybody in this room is quite smart, since you are smart, you are not going to repeat your old mistakes. You are expected to learn from your own mistakes. If you are really, really smart, you are not going to learn your own mistakes because you are not making mistakes. You are learning lessons from somebody else's mistakes. But Russians repeating, unfortunately, the same mistakes over and over and over again. Let me give you an example. It is a kind of almost 10 months apart. May 2022, Russians tried to build a bridge over this river. It was Seversky Donetsk, and the Russians, since it is since the Russians building some kind of pontoon bridge in here, Russians massed a lot of troops the other side of the river, the other side of a canal. And Ukrainians pinpointed this place, and they mobilized their scarce resources and bombarded this area. Russian loss, 1 division, and the battlefield killed 1,500 soldiers. It was largest single battle casualty in the war until that time. However, this record replaced over and over and over again. February 2023, last year, at the beginning of the last year, Bldg, Russians invaded the open plant and open field, and Ukraine built a series of defenses. What is interesting is Russians sent small units on the exactly identical path almost 12 times. Wave 1 defeated. Wave 2 lost. Wave 3 stopped. Wave 4 stalled. Russians' piecemeal attacks repeatedly and continuously failed. and they replaced the record. On a single day, Russians lost 5,000. And repeating the same thing. Russians, for some reason, Russians failed to learn their lessons. The problem is, lack of learning process is not so limited to the Russians, but also it is an issue of Ukraine. That's why I said comparative incompetence. Unfortunately, Russians and the Ukrainians look like competing to prove that they are more competent. It is so crazy. Let me give you the first example. February 2022, it was a part of the Russian occupation area, and Ukraine counterattacked this area. It was clearly the textbook faint motion. Russians believe that Ukraine is kind of going to have invasion in this area in the south, so they just redeployed most of the soldiers from here to here. However, Ukraine invaded in the north. Over the process, Russia proved that they have no eyes and no ears. There is no way to reconnaissance Ukrainians' behavior. Russians were blind and deaf, continuously, over and over again. So in the 2 years ago, it was September 2022, Ukraine recovered almost 20 times larger area than the Seoul metropolitan area. And it was, unfortunately, the end of the Ukrainians' counterattack. Ukrainians got emboldened, and they decided to counterattack once again. The NATO summit was scheduled July 2023. Since the NATO, the Western countries, provided a lot of weapons and the food, monies, and the technical and the intelligence support to Ukrainians. So Ukraine, the Kiev, and especially the President Zelensky, needed something to prove that all of these assistance are useful. So Ukraine decided to counterattack in June. They attacked the Russian front. However, Russians deployed in defense in depth. Defense in depth is basically it's our defense line is not just a single line. It is a series of the trench lines, and all of the depth of this trench line is, in Russia's case, and the deepest area is 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers is the size of almost half of the size of Seoul, the radius. And then, on the eve of the Ukrainian counterattack, Ukrainian combat commanders delivered a speech. And he just basically said that since we have American infantry fighting vehicle, IFV, and since we have German Leopard tanks, Russians would surrender. They are not talking about tactical competence. They were talking about their weapons and technology. All of these statements proved to be wrong, and Russia simply successfully stopped the Ukrainians' counterattack, and Kiev lost substantial part of its manpower. This is a kind of end of Russia's and Ukrainians' tactical incompetence? No. after that, for the last 10 years, Russians started to steamroll Ukrainian positions, not with the tactical competence, but with human waves attack. Human waves attack is basically they are just sending the same unit on the same path, on the same front, against same Ukrainian defensive positions, and they just depleted most of its weapons. Moscow depleted so much of artillery shells, and they have to import artillery shells from North Korea. Let me give you a kind of rare statistics about the artillery shell. In the First World War, in the 110 years ago, you are going to need, if you shoot 100 shells against enemy positions, probably you expect to kill 2 soldiers on the ground. If you shoot 100, you are going to kill 2. It was 110 years ago. In the Second World War, so the 40 years ago, if you shoot 100, you might expect to kill 3 soldiers. In these days, since we have a better technology, and since the Russians are not learning their tactical lessons on the ground, so we have much higher number. In Ukraine, if you shoot 100, you might, if you are lucky, you might expect to kill 8 soldiers. Which means that they consume, Russia and Ukraine, they consume billions of shells. Russian casualties, so is so severe. In the last summer, in the last winter, almost a year ago, November and December 2023, Russians in the 2 months lost 13,000 soldiers and wounded. Per square mile, to capture, Russians had to sacrifice 3,000 soldiers. This is human waves attack against well-prepared, well-defended Ukrainian position. So in the last summer, we have the change of fortune here. 이걸로 하면 안 되는구나. Here, Ukraine invaded from this area. So if you have good eyesight, you are probably recognize a kind of a small red dot in here. Small red dots in some red areas in here. That was Russian territory occupied by the Ukrainians. It was a big stake, and it was a big risk. Basically, this is a junk bond in terms of tactical, strategic operation. Russian concentrated in the textbook response. Russians are expected to concentrate its forces in here to defend, to stop the Ukrainians' incursion. However, Russians decided not to do that. Instead, Putin concentrated its forces in here, in Donbass, so they just competitively cutting their throats with each other. They are not defending with each other. They are literally attacking with each other. Usually, in a battlefield, when the other side attacks you, first response for you is to defend yourself. But in these days, both of the countries are not defending themselves. They are simply expanding their territories to occupy. Russians failed to prove their tactical competence. Ukrainians as loud as their counterpart. So on the ground, things are so bad. Russians in these days conducted a series of air attacks and the drones bombardment on Ukrainian cities and inflicting pains and the civilian casualties. However, on the ground, things don't change much. Then, is it bad thing? It is something new? Unfortunately, no. Let me give you an example of the First World War 110 years ago. We have a picture of this. On the right, you are going to see the British trench line. On the right, this is a German trench line. The photo was taken in June 1917. It was one of the most famous First World War air reconnaissance photos. Over the process, we have increased the growth in the firepower and the lethality of the weapons. However, the nature, the essence of the ground warfare don't change much. First World War was so well organized in some cases. On the Vimy front, United Kingdom used 50,000 tons of ammunition on a single German position. On Messines, British mobilization was so massive, 140,000 tons. Per mile, it was 1,200 tons of munitions on the German position. The explosive power was practically equivalent to the tactical nuclear attack against the German position. It was 110 years ago. Depends in depth that the Russians were so proud of their stopping power against Ukrainian incursion in June 2023. It was quite common. In terms of tactical lessons, we conceptualize the idea as it depends in depth. Basically, the defenders tried to decombine. The attackers are expected to combine all of the different units in the single combat task force. Then the defenders are expected to decombine the enemy's combined forces. Defense in depth is the best way to disconnect, discombine enemies, adversaries, infantry, engineers, and tanks and artillery. It proved to be highly effective 110 years ago and still today. In these days, Russians are literally run out of these steams and most of these shells. So Russian bombardment 10,000 shells per day. It was practically 150 tons per day. However, it was only 1% of Great Britain used upon Messines, on the Messines, on a single day. Russian firepower, everybody believed that. Russian firepower was believed to be extremely effective and massive. However, now we know that we are wrong. Russians simply have no capability to do that. Another way to understand is this. People are talking about we have a miraculous new technology, drones and AI. Drones and AI is kind of proved to be the futuristic future on the ground. Unfortunately, it's not the case. We believe almost 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we believed in the future, we are going to mobilize drones in a swarming way, which means that we just put these small drones together and we can just guide them, and ultimately our enemy failed to defend themselves against hundreds of the thousands of small ship drones. The problem is, on a battlefield, we just simply recognize that all of these drones are so cheap and small, they are extremely vulnerable to jamming. At the beginning of the war, until last year, drones has kind of 40% effective. If you shoot 100 drones against enemy positions, 40% of them just hit the target. In these days, the percentage is 10% and less. And the best way to counter these the jamming attack is we need to put some anti-jamming technology, jamming proofing technology to each of our drones. The problem is, if you put extra technology on your drones, the cost would be higher. The drones in these days are not cheap and are not small. This is action and reaction and countermeasure dynamics on the ground. Probably those who survive would be the smartest. Not the smartest survive on the battlefield. Instead, drones are effective like this. For what? For our eyes and for our ears, only for the reconnaissance. Not for our punch, not for our attacks. Future. Russia failed, unfortunately or fortunately. Failed to achieve its political objectives, and NATO expanded more. Last year, we have Finland and Sweden into the Atlantic Alliance as an additional members. This is something unexpected. Ukraine, in future, in decades to come, Ukrainians might be the member of EU and the NATO more. Everything depends on the political environment, especially in the United States, especially to who's going to be the president in the next election, in the next US presidency election. But in the long run, since the political and the military bond between the two countries, I mean the Ukrainians on the one hand and the Europeans on the other, the Western Europeans on the other, it's very difficult to undermine this connection. Russia is seriously wounded, weakened militarily and economically. So let's say that Donald Trump wins the election, and I believe that he's going to terminate Russia's war in Ukraine in a month or two by simply stopping the American assistance to Kyiv. The war would be over. I can guarantee. However, Russia is so weakened in these days. Therefore, Russia would not behave more expansionistically and more revisionistically anymore. In this sense, American strategic objective is already good. It's already gotten. The real problem is Russia and China, relative power balance. 5 years ago, Russian economy was going on, and the Chinese economy was booming. I mean, these days, both of these countries are in trouble. The problem is, which country is more in trouble? Russia. So Putin used to be is a kind of equal partner to Xi Jinping, but in future, in decades to come, I'm afraid Russia will be the China's junior partner. Whether Putin likes it or not, this is something that we are going to see. Which means that in decades to come, what we are going to see, at least in your future, would be something like the Cold War in terms of polarity. During the Cold War, we had the two great powers, Soviet Union and the United States. That is why the Cold War was bipolarity. In these days, the war in Ukraine strengthened two powers, duopoly of the relative capability. So it's going to strengthen the bipolarity, a second bipolarity in decades to come. Russia is bitterly wounded and revisionist. So Beijing will have a lot of difficulties in handling Russia, but this is Chinese job, not ours. This is a kind of a long-term anticipation. In the short-term estimate, I'm afraid, and many of these kind of analysts in this field are kind of concerned about Russia is so cornered, so desperate, therefore they are going to do something tough. Russia's military capability is seriously damaged. Conventionally, what I'm saying. Russia's weapon, hardware, and the stockpiles, most of them is simply gone. Russian software, we know that. Now we know that Russians' military tactic is so bad. They fail to learn lessons out of their bloody battlefield failures. Russia is broken. If that is the case, then logically, Putin had one choice, to give up his ambition. But it's not likely. Therefore, Putin's Russia will keep challenging to the status quo, to the established order in Eastern Europe, over and over and over again. The problem is, since he is weakened, he is damaged, he lost too many conventional weapons, then he's going to mobilize nukes. He's going to, in my opinion, Russia is more likely to repeat threat to use nuclear weapons at the bargaining phase. If you are not accept our positions, we are going to nuke you over and over again. Not nuclear attack on the battlefield on the Ukraine, but in years to come, in the decades to come. Which means that during the Cold War and until today, we have somewhat highly established and highly strengthened nuclear threshold. This threshold is extremely difficult to go over. Maybe we call it nuclear taboo. The real problem is now taboo is weakened, threshold is lowered, then it's not going to be easy to deter bitterly revisionist Russia in years to come. And we have a power balance. China will be stronger. Whether we like it or not, this is a kind of a reality that we are going to see in the future. Who's going to be the leader? the whole world looks like split it into the two camps. The one is led by the Americans, used to be led by the Americans, but the American US president, one of the US presidential candidates decided not to take that responsibility. On the other hand, we have revisionist camp, a group of countries who are challenging to the established order, who tried to change the balance of power and territorial status quo in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, and in East Asia. Who's going to be the leader? 10 years ago, maybe we can say that China plus Russia, but which is not the case. China will be the leader, and Russia seems like stepping down out of the position. China controls the Russian market. Russia supplies its energy resources to China. That's the only way to feed its people. So that is why I characterize Russia at the beginning of this presentation as a Saudi Arabia with nuclear weapons and geopolitical ambition. Russians failed to supply enough weapons, enough munitions for its army. So Moscow is borrowing weapons. And in this, today's newspaper said that Russians are deploying the North Korean soldiers on the European front. I'm not sure whether this report is true. And what is certain is Russia has used so many of its military stocks, so it almost depleted its military resources. Except for one thing, nukes. So things are bad in three ways. Russia is bitterly revisionist. China will be the leader. And Russia depleted most of its weapons. So it's going to depend more and more upon the nuclear munitions. The last thing that I'd like to address is this. We have a war in Ukraine, and the people are talking about next time we are going to have the similar thing in Taiwan. But this is beyond that I was told to present on today's presentation. So let me stop here, and we have 15 minutes left, and I'm going to take questions.
Okay, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. So Professor Lee has provided background information and theory perspective, plus kind of what are some strategic issues for the both sides. So he has provided very interesting topic and issues, but I know we are not going to have every question, but if you have any question, please be concise, and also I will collect some of them, and I will just let him respond to all together. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and please briefly identify yourself and question. So we are going to collect questions. If you have any question, please raise your hand, and I will just identify.
I'm writing my dissertation on drones, so it was really helpful. And my question is this: you said that in this Russia-Ukraine war, the strike capability of the drones were not as effective, and rather it is more effective only in reconnaissance or patrol. So does that? But in other cases, like the use of the U.S. drones in Iraq and Afghanistan war, they proved much more useful in terms of strike capability. So is your argument limited to this Ukraine-Russia war about the drones effectiveness, or is it more generally applicable? Thank you.
Okay, any question over there?
Thank you, Professor Lee, for your presentation. My name is Jiyeoun from SNU GSIS. So if I'm correct, I think the main point of this presentation was about the technical incompetency between the two countries. So I was wondering if there are any actions are going to be implemented to improve those incompetency. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, please. And then we will just let Professor Lee respond.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. My name is Bldg. I'm a student here at GSS. My question is, what is the current status of the Wagner Group?
Hey, yeah. First, Wagner Group. They are simply gone. Because the last year, the head of the Wagner Group practically kind of assassinated after his kind of a show of coup. So the whole organization is simply gone and disorganized, dismantled. And the second, the training, they are so lousy. So what is interesting is that at the beginning of the war, Ukraine's shared almost 20-25% of its armed forces, and to evacuated 20% or 25% of its best soldiers evacuated from the front, and they were trained for a year in Germany and Poland. And they are simply gone. In the unsuccessful counterattack, June 2020, last year, the summer of last year. So, however, in contrast, Russians paid practically no attention to training. They simply mobilized a lot of soldiers and conducted the human waves attack against the Ukrainian position, and they simply depleted its manpower. Drones. Americans are good at drones. The Russians and Ukrainians are lousy. That's what I'm saying? No. What I'm saying is drone technology, that the American drones are extremely expensive. As I said, 5 to 10 years ago, people believed that in the future we are going to use a lot of cheap, small drones as a swarming. Have you seen what is that? The Angel Has Fallen, the movie? The U.S. Secret Service guy is kind of he's in the frame and trapped in the guy, and American president was attacked by the drones when he was fishing. Do you see the kind of magical maneuver of drones in the movie? That's what people believed 5 to 10 years ago. What I'm saying is that kind of a thing is not possible. Why? Because if you want to do this, you are going to spend a lot of money. These drones are not cheap, are not small. American drones are extremely expensive. Sometimes they cost $20 to $30 billion per unit. People are talking about, but in these days, people are talking about $1,000 drones or the $500 drones from Temu or the Alibaba. Things are different. Any other questions?
Questions? The first, and then second, and third.
Hi, my name is Kira Zobek, and I'm a PhD candidate here at GSIS. You briefly mentioned Russia's potential usage of nuclear weapons as well as their threats, specifically back in 2022. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists recently published an article that Russia might be more likely to use nuclear weapons if they're winning the war, to end the war more quickly, just because of the adverse effects that the war has already had economically and politically for them. I was wondering what your opinions on this might be, especially as interest and support on the Ukrainian side is continuing to wane from the Western side. Thank you.
For your presentation. I was wondering, let's say you were an advisor to President Zelensky and he agrees with you about the increasing possibility of Russia using nukes. What would you recommend to him that Ukraine should do? And maybe the same question for if you were advising the US president and maybe the Chinese president.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for your talk. I was more interested in the EU's role. So what do you think is the EU's tactical impact of their financial blockade and boycott of Russia? Thank you.
Any other question? Probably he is the question, and he will be the last question, and then Professor Lee can respond.
Good afternoon. My name is Emir. I'm a master's student at the School of Law. So thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Lee. So my question is about Russia in February 2022. As most of the politicians and all the citizens, everyone think that the war will be finished in 2 weeks, in 1 week, maybe in 3 days. At the very beginning of the war, there was no such supporting from Western side, as you mentioned before, 2023, 77 billion, etc. So what's your opinion about it? Why Russia not ended the war in 2 weeks and 1 month before that was such a big support for Western countries? What was the actual incompetence specifically? Thank you.
Any final questions? Because I know you have a class at 2, so probably we can hold until 2 p.m. So if any questions or okay, 2 probably wait for another round. We can have everything. So
Okay, the likelihood of the nuclear attack, to your question. Well, Alex Downs published a book almost 10 years ago, which was targeting civilians in the world. And in his work, states are more likely to inflict the pains on the civilians on 2 conditions. One is that the war is stalemated, so they want to kind of have some kind of a breakthrough, not on the battlefield, on a kind of political front. So they are going to use massive strategic bombing, use gas on the civilians. In that case, this is something that fits with Putin's condition right now. War is stalemated. The second condition that Alex Downs presented is the attackers are interested in the territory, not the people. That fits also with Russia's war in Ukraine. So in this case, Russia is highly likely to use a nuclear weapon. But in my opinion, since the Western countries, the Western country and the United States and the NATO, all of these are kind of indirectly involved in this country. What we are seeing is a kind of a nuclear deterrence by the Western powers against Russians. And what if I'm the advisor to the Zelensky and the US and Chinese president? I hate that idea. That is one of the reasons that I choose to be a school teacher rather than the policy work. What if I'm the Zelensky's advisor? And I don't want to be responsible for anything except for the school students' grade. But what I'm trying to say, but if it ends the position, if I were in the shoes of the Zelensky's advisor, I would say that we'll use more conventional forces against the Russians because the nuclear threshold is still somewhat high to go over. So it's our chance to challenge against Russia's occupied territory in Donbass. That's what I advise. In contrast, in the Americans' advice, it depends upon who's going to be president in the next election. If Donald Trump is in the White House once again, then nothing would work. So I forget about that. Harris, we are going to extend U.S. support to Ukraine, not believe that Ukraine would win, but because I know that this is very cruel to say that this is the most effective and cost-effective way to weaken Russia's capability. We want Russia bleed to white. China, I would say the exact same thing. The weaker China would be the interest in the China, so let them fight continuously more and more, and that is the best way for us, for China, to take advantage of the situation. Financial boycott. It is very tricky to say, but as far as I know, there is no evidence that Russia is suffering, which means that nothing works. What was the last question? I'm sorry.
Question.
Yeah.
The question was about, you mentioned that as many politicians, you also think that the Russian war will finish, Russo-Ukrainian war will finish in first 2 weeks, so I correctly understand. So the first time it was not big support from Western side, Western countries, from US and etc. So what's the reason of the Russian longest of the war? Why is that not finished in 2 weeks, 1 week? Because they had a really good military in the beginning of February.
No, that's
Tactical incompetence or something specifically?
we have thousands of reasons. I mean, as I said, the success have the, and the failures always have orphan. Failures are orphan, and we have thousands of ways to go. That thing, the why things went wrong on the battleground, and one of them is simply Russians are simply lousy on the battlefield. We simply don't know. The only thing, another thing, the systematic way, the political science way to answer this, the military lousiness, is that Russian army was designed to be lousy. Why? Because Putin hated to be challenged by the military commanders in the series of a kind of in the political competition within Russia. So a lot of third world countries, especially in the Middle East, local armies are designed to be poor. It is usually called coup-proofing. Armies are especially divided into the several different and independent organizations, and sometimes we have mercenary groups, and we have a lot of secret police, and the chain of command are divided. All of these things that happen in the Middle East and Russia too. Wagner Group played a very important role, politically important role, not military important role. Why? Because that's the best way to let them compete with each other. Russian commanders on the Russian regular forces commanders on the one hand, and the leader of Wagner Group on the other. That happens.
Okay, two students, just your last questions. First and then a second.
Oh, yeah, please.
Hello, I'm Gabriel. I'm an exchange student here from Sweden. Thank you very much for the lecture. I wanted to ask about the NATO expansion for political reasons. And as Sweden and Finland joined because of Russia's invasion, I wanted to ask about Russia's interpretation of this development. Do they consider NATO to be more active, or do they see it as more of a failure from Russia because they pushed Sweden and Finland to totally change their domestic policies, or maybe some other reaction to this? Thank you. Thank you, sir. I have basically two questions. The first one is about, you talk about Ukraine, so I'm concerned about the actual size of Ukraine. So you put together maybe France, Spain, and Germany together, you get Ukraine. So that way, I think the length of these the front lines, I think it plays a crucial role. So that way, I would want to hear from you whether the Russian side at the beginning of this fight, whether they had a calculation, people of Ukraine, those who really speak in Russian, and the moral side of this issue, whether they had any calculation over like what happened in maybe Austria in 1939. So the people of that part of the region may be supportive of the Russian forces coming in. So I see from the other side because
It should be quick. We are going on.
Okay, so the other question is about the very foundation of NATO. I hear that the very foundation is to bring the American heads, the Germans down and the Russians away. So you talk about the Russian-Chinese connection, so I want to hear what will happen in Europe. So I didn't understand.
Okay, in the Russian NATO expansion, Russians hate the idea of the additional expansion of NATO. The problem is Russians are so busy with fighting in the Ukraine, so they simply, I believe that they just simply disregarded this issue anymore. And the Donbass, Russian-speaking population is concentrated there. And on the eve of Ukrainian war, almost 20% of the 20% of the Ukrainian population are Russian speakers. They are Russian sympathizers. The problem is all of them are kind of evacuated to Russia. So nowadays, in terms of ethnic homogeneity, Ukraine is more homogeneous than it used to be. It is a kind of a ethnic, I don't want to say this, but it is a kind of ethnic kind of separation, practically. And what was the last one?
Well, it's about the NATO.
Oh,
what will happen? I mean, you talk about China-Russia connection.
Yeah, China. Okay, Hastings estimates that Russia has the NATO has three purposes: keep the Americans in, Russians out, and the Germans down. Mm-hmm. And what about China? In these days, or 2 years ago, 3 years ago, NATO summit said that China is a systemic threat. And they just tried to expand their strategic landscape in these days. However, in my opinion, NATO has its own problem right now. So the China is probably a systemic threat to Americans, but it's not the NATO's problem. I believe that would be a kind of a rhetoric rather than the substantial and the significant change in the NATO's serious strategic perspective. This is my guess, but who knows?
Okay, we will close the seminar right now. So please give a big hand of applause to Professor Geunwook Lee for his wonderful lecture and